Hi, this is a repeat of the Recognises Losses seminar in the All About Loss series because a recording of the actual event didn't work. So I'm just going to repeat the content here and hope that it's of benefit to those of you that weren't able to come. In the session we did online, we had Cameron Butland and Emma Richardson with us to give us some support to talk about resources, and Cameron did a spiritual reflection on loss. Of course, we can't do that here now. I begin with this picture of Piglet, which I found Piglet in Durham Station, clearly something that had been lost by somebody, and it seemed to be very sad as I remembered what happened when my children lost their favourite toys when they were little. And maybe as adults lose things too, we might be better at hiding our grief and upset that we feel when we've lost something that we hold precious, but still it's there, isn't it? We all recognise easily the grief we feel when a person who we love dies. Without undervaluing that grief, I want to also acknowledge that we might suffer a variety of kinds of losses which cause us grief, unless and until we recognise those losses as real. So the accompanying grief will also remain unacknowledged. So today, what I'm hoping to talk about are the losses that we experience, particularly in this time of lockdown, but generally throughout our lives, and the grief which may accompany that. Of course, there are multiple losses, and it might feel like a domino effect that several things are lost at once, and that feels like an accumulation of grief. And we mustn't undervalue that's importance to people. I'm a great fan of local radio, and I heard somebody on local radio saying, I feel less of a man because I'm not able to get a job. I thought that was very sad, because his lack of a job didn't just mean a material loss, which we might expect, but it meant a loss of his whole sense of self, didn't it? His gender even somehow affected him biologically. There's a huge depletion here. And it makes us ask, really, what is it that makes us who we are? For this person, clearly, his job made him, to some extent, what he was. And the emotions of his job loss were deep and profound. When we think about what makes us what we are, what we're attached to, what helps us, gives us meaning, helps us make meaning of situations, that would be different for all of us. And so we'll have different levels of grief depending on our attachment, on how much who we are rests on that person or relationship or object which we have lost. So let me give you an example here from my own life. My sister gave up a really good job when her children were born and didn't really work as she was bringing them up. And so when they went to university, she felt absolutely lost, because she had been for 18, 20 years their mother. I felt less of such a loss when my children went to university, and because I've got different things to which I'm attached and different things which give me a sense of who I am. So there's a little lesson there that somebody might feel a huge sense of grief when they've lost something for which you can't quite understand the attachment. It's really easy when somebody dies for us to be sympathetic, but less easy sometimes when we have those losses that affect us. So what's happening now would be my question. What are the losses that we see being experienced and the emotions then created? In this period of lockdown, what is it that you have lost? What is it that your neighbours or those people for you whom you have pastoral care have lost? So these losses give us all a sense of grief. Next time, I'm going to talk much more about grief, but I didn't want to mention it here. There's something of shock and disbelief. There's something about realizing the pain of loss. Sometimes when the grief is sudden and the loss is sudden, that sudden grief feels traumatic, and it might have physiological effects. There's a sense of disorientation, of not knowing where you are, that the ground beneath you is shaky. A sense of yearning for what is lost. Some people go out looking for the lost thing, even the lost person. Anger, anxiety, guilt, despair even. And of course, then there's the next stage, which is about reorganization and recovery and reinvestment. We've got that to come as a society coming out of lockdown. We're not thinking about it just yet, but maybe we should have an eye to it now. What happens? How do we come out of grief, really, as a whole nation? Grief can be long-lasting, and that can come as a surprise to us when we want to be in control of ourselves. I want to introduce in this slide to Big Ted. This is Big Ted. My brother was the first Christmas baby in Newcastle in 1968 and was given this teddy. I'll tell you the story of Big Ted and how he comes to be in a cardboard box later on. Mitchell and Anderson, whose book I've based most of what I'm saying today on, says to be human is to be a griever of all kinds of losses. The thing we know is that nothing lasts forever, apart, of course, from God. But all our material, human, earthly stuff dies. Sometimes there's rebirth, but it dies and we lose it. Mitchell and Anderson suggest these 5 kind of contrasting states of loss. Nothing's ever quite as straightforward or as simple as this, but I think it's helpful to help us think about it. There's avoidable and unavoidable loss. We can be unsympathetic with people who have avoidable loss. Those people that have given up their families or prioritize their work over their family, so they end up being lonely. We can kind of say, oh, you know, you made your bed, so lie in it. And actually, as pastoral carers, we need to be sympathetic to those whose losses were avoidable because of the choices they made. Maybe even in retrospect, they know they made the wrong choices, as do we all. And those unavoidable losses that happen to us almost despite us. And not only do we lose the thing that we've lost, for example, if we'd lost Big Ted or we'd lost our children because they've gone to university, we've also lost control over the situation. And that adds another layer of loss, that sense of not being in control, which a lot of people feel now. I'm not sure that has to be, and I think we can be more conscious of the choices we're making. So while the government have asked people to stay at home, those people that are staying at home are choosing to stay at home, are choosing that advice because they want to protect themselves and protect others. And I think that's a much better way, more healthy way of looking at it than we're being forced to stay in our house, to we're choosing to stay in the house following this very strong suggestions from our government. There's temporary losses and permanent losses. I think the situation we're at the moment, we hope is temporary, but we don't know how long for. And there might be some aspects of it that turn out to be permanent. So that temporary permanent thing is really important to notice. There's actual loss and imagined loss. I think that ties in really much with anticipated and unanticipated loss. However, the actual and the imagined is the loss we fear that will take place and hasn't yet. And I think that's the anxiety that we're feeling now of people that are very frightened about either catching a virus or that somebody in their family will catch COVID-19. The imagined can be self-deception. I've been reading Othello recently, and there's Othello who sees the green-eyed monster of jealousy and imagines that he's lost his wife's love, although that's all in his imagination and not actual. a lot of this has got to do with self-esteem, doesn't it? If somebody has strong self-esteem and those things which give them identity and they can be sure about, they'll be less anxious about losing either people they love or things they love. So this all ties back in to those issues of identity. Anticipated grief. When we anticipate loss, we can begin to grieve before we've done it. So the grief is more spread out. So for example, when I left my parish to come and work in Cumbria 3 years ago, I knew that I was going to. I wasn't allowed to announce it for a little while. So I began to separate myself from the situation. So there was some anticipated grief, which helped the grief of leaving, feel less shocking. Unanticipated grief can be a sudden shock. There can be physiological trauma that happens with unanticipated grief. Your body might bear the marks of it. Leaving and being left. People sometimes don't want to leave. They feel guilty about leaving. We probably all know families where children haven't been allowed to leave or given permission to leave, and so they stay. So there's a lot of guilt attached. Sometimes in very unhappy marriages, or when people are unhappy at work, they'll create a situation where they're sacked or where they're divorced rather than do the leaving themselves. And of course, people who are left might not blame themselves. They might blame the person who has left, whether that's true or not. I'm interested in stories of elderly people who feel that their children have left them, have abandoned them, even though they visit quite regularly and phone quite regularly. And that sense of being left isn't real. It's kind of imagined. But what has been left, I think, are the previous relationships and the previous way that the family operated. So Mitchell and Anderson talk about 6 kinds of losses, and I'm going to start with material loss, which of course was Piglet. It's a loss of an object or familiar surroundings to which there is important attachment, things with extrinsic value, or maybe are a gift from someone and they're deeply loved because they're attached to a human being or a relationship, whereas things with intrinsic value have some quality of their own, which means that we're attached to them. Some material losses are replaceable. I wonder what happens when a pet dies. Mitchell and Anderson thinks we treat pets as material objects rather than as relationships. So have a think about that. When a pet dies, we often go and get another one. And I wonder what the material losses are in lockdown. Some people have genuinely lost work and will have fewer things. I think the material losses probably are more manifest in places. That there's a sense of a loss of places when we're restricted and not allowed to go to the places that we love or the places that we're used to being at. That's felt as a material loss. Relationship losses. I've got a picture here of a wedding. I was going to use a picture of the wedding of my best friend. I was very delighted. She was getting married in middle age. But I missed her as she had met and fallen in love with her man. And she was investing more in that relationship. And I think that's fair enough. But she in moving from a single life to a married life also had losses. And we look at a ceremony like this and say, isn't it fantastic? And it is lots to celebrate. But we also have to remember that there is loss. When a mother has a baby, those parents lose quite a lot of freedom as they take on the responsibility. Of course, they're going to argue that it's worth it. But we just have to remember that a lot of these things have loss attached to them. When we lose somebody, We lose good aspects of the relationship and bad aspects of the relationship. And the loss can be temporary or permanent. So it's not just death. We think about relationship losses in terms of death most often, and I think they're the most dramatic. But actually, we lose people a lot, lose people when they move away, lose people when life changes, we lose people quite a lot when you move jobs, when you move house. I wonder if we feel relationship loss right now, although we're hoping that it's temporary. We've lost, I think, while we might be holding on to our closest relationships, we've lost the casual acquaintanceship that we have with people. The inevitability is that all relationships are lost because we're not immortal. Although I do a lot of funerals for people who think that even death is temporary and that after death we'll be reunited with those people that we love. So they don't necessarily see death as a permanent end to the relationship, just temporary. Let me just read what Mitchell and Anderson have said. Relationship loss is the ending of opportunities to relate oneself to, talk with, share experiences with, make love to, touch, settle issues with, fight with, and otherwise be in the emotional and or physical presence of another particular human being. I want to talk about intrapsychic loss next. I've used this picture, which I found online, of children playing football, really because all three of my boys wanted at some stage when they were growing up to be footballers. They've grown up and realised that they're not going to be footballers for a number of different reasons. One of them, not least, because he thought he was going to be a goalkeeper and he couldn't stop goals. Intrapsychic loss is a change in dreams, an acknowledgement of reality, that this thing that you were dreaming about isn't going to happen. It's a really familiar thing that happens in adolescence. I think it happens in growing up as well. I think it's one of the losses when couples realise they can't have a child. There's an intrapsychic loss, a dream of that happens at stillbirth too. Not just the loss of the relationship and the loss of the human being, but the loss of the dreams associated. After Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the moon, it's reported that he didn't really know what to do next. His whole life had been focused on the dream of getting to the moon, and he did it, wow. But then afterwards realised that he'd met his dream and he had to reassess. It can be a change in perception of somebody. My eldest son was a chorister for 5 or 6 years, and the person that led his choir was imprisoned last year for paedophile offences. I'm not revealing anything that happened to my son because nothing did. But the intrapsychic loss for him was that he's had to completely reassess those 5 or 6 years with a man with whom he trusted, who taught him to sing, who had a huge influence on his life and his talents. And that can happen to us quite a lot. That intrapsychic loss can be a loss and a reconfiguring of the dreams, a reconfiguring of what we think reality is. I think that's happening loads at the moment. When we really try and work out what it is that's important, and we realise maybe that the things we were dreaming of that we thought were important aren't actually, and that other things have more value for us. The next one is functional loss, which happens most often in aging. It can be general, it can be gradual, and it's often denied. There's a denial of these functional losses because often they lead to a lack of independence and a dependency on others, but it's still a cause of grief. And somebody that's snappy about it, I'm beginning to lose my hearing and get quite snappy with my family when I can't hear them. it's an expression of my grief, I think, rather than my real anger. And I wonder how much that happens really around you for those things, those functions that are being lost. And of course, not always possible to replace. And the loss, certainly of bodily functions, might be experienced as overwhelming. My mum had macular degeneration and was losing the sight, definitely in one eye, but a bit in the other too. And she wouldn't stop driving. She was just in denial about her lack of vision and kept driving. We'll probably know lots of people like that. I'm wondering then about the temporary illness that so many people are experiencing at the moment, that loss of function, especially with people who have COVID-19 now, and how angry they may be. Looks like there's a long recovery period associated with it for some people, and how that might be. Third one is role loss. I've got this lovely picture of these lads, which I found on the internet. So they're not people I know, but I guess they could be. We have a place in social networks. One of these will be the joker, one of them will be the leader, one of them will be the carer. We play different roles in our networks, in our groups of people. And I think when those groups of people are separated and no longer attached to each other, we have a sense of the loss of that, that we've lost some people and some relationship, and actually we've lost our own role in them. If you think about the people you work with or the people in your churches, there are the people that are the carers, the people that give out the hymn books, the people that are practical, the people that do the sweeping up, the people that will crack a joke, and the people that always reply if you ask a question in the sermon. They're really important. The place in the social network is really important for your sense of yourself, because we know who we are from our relationship with others. So when that's broken, even temporarily, that becomes a huge loss for us. And the most obvious example of this is in retirement. People who retire have a huge sense of loss as they've lost their role. People whose children leave home or go to university also have a huge sense of loss and a bit of disorientation, no longer quite knowing who they are. We might find we no longer have a part to play, or that we don't know the lines. I see it quite a lot in my training of curates. So people give up work and they've had good jobs with responsibility. Quite often they've been towards the top of their hierarchy of whatever it is that they do quite often, and they give it up and they become bottom of the pile, and then they're curates and they feel really disempowered in that process, that they have to start learning again. And in terms of institutional hierarchy, we're in the bottom. They're no less important. Don't hear me say that. But it's really difficult to accept the giving up of roles. So ordination's a fantastic honour, but for a lot of people there are losses which need to be grieved and acknowledged, often not acknowledged. And systemic loss. So we're back to Big Ted, who I introduced you to previously. And I'm going to tell you this story that when my mum died, my dad had died 15 years previously. So my brother and sister and I had to empty the family home. She was a hoarder and she didn't throw things away. She didn't let anybody else throw things away, although my dad secretly had bonfires that she didn't quite know about. So Big Ted was there in the back of a cupboard. My brother didn't want him, so off he went. That's a symbol of the systemic loss. So we didn't just lose material things. Our family as a system works differently without my mother, who held it together. I think the system had been changing over a number of years anyway. But the relationship that we had with my mum was a key relationship for the way the system of our family worked. If you've been involved in churches where a church warden has died, you'll experience that systemic loss. So there's a relationship loss going on, but actually there's also a systemic loss of somebody's gone. And the system loss doesn't rely on the relationship between the individuals who are part of the system. The example of a young person leaving home is given by Mitchell and Anderson, and the father says, our family won't be the same again. So, you know, there's a temporary loss of the child, but also a real sense that things have changed fundamentally. Now, I think there's a big lot of systemic loss happening to us at the moment. Our church systems are working differently. Do you know, even going to the supermarket, it's not a system we can rely on anymore. We stand in a queue, which is odd. We keep 2 meters apart, don't really chat. I've noticed I do quite a lot of chatting when I go to the supermarket, but I'm getting to realize that I can't quite do that. Workplaces are different because people are furloughed. So there's a lot of people in the systems, not only to carry the workload, but to take, not only in their role, but it means the whole systems of things change. You can hear probably as I'm speaking that none of these losses can be separate. So when you lose something, there'll be a whole lot of other things that are lost as well. So we can see that there's a multiple kind of losses going on when we experience one loss. It does mean that we can resist change. This systemic loss thing, I think, accounts for quite a lot of our resistance to change in church. And the grief when systems do change. So in this period in Cumbria, when we're introducing mission communities, and some of the systems of how church works is changing, we need to know that there's grief for what's being left behind. We need to acknowledge that grief. So I want to talk a little bit about support. I've used this picture that says up. It was up at the bottom of a mountain on the Isle of Mull, and I thought that was great. The only way is up. Got to acknowledge what's going on, admit it, admit the multiple losses. They're magnified. There might be a domino effect. Our isolation is part of our loss, and it magnifies the senses of grief. Social networks are so important. We know ourselves through our relationship with others. I think theologically, the image of the Trinity in perfect union with one another, communion, shows us the model for being. So keep at it. And I'd encourage you to encourage other people to keep at it as a social network. Things have loosened up a little bit, and you can meet one other person for a walk. That's a really powerful thing to do, and remind people that that's possible. I have 2 lovely ladies in our village who are both well over 80, and they meet every Wednesday for a socially distanced lunch. One sits in the summer house, one sits outside the summer house in one of their gardens, and they take a packed lunch, they take a flask. And they were determined that they weren't going to lose that relationship with each other, because they were used to seeing each other much more often than once a week. But that time is very important for them. So I'd encourage that. Balance. A lot of this stuff can make us feel unbalanced, unsteady, ill at ease, losing our self-esteem, losing our sense of ourselves. You can feel that uncertainty, like we're standing on shifting sands at the moment, don't know what's going to happen next. Really important to try and find a sense of balance. I'm really in favour of making a cup of tea. We know how to make a cup of tea. There's a tea bag, there's a kettle, there's milk. We can do it, and it can bring us back to a sense of, okay, at least I can be in control of making a cup of tea. Routines, people keep talking about routines as being so important, and a sense of what is it that makes me who I am, and trying to retain that in some way, to keep some hope. As Christians, we have hope. We are a resurrection people, saved from death, knowing the future glory. And we can embody that hope for other people that have none. So as Christian pastors, we can bring hope where there is none, just by our very being. Think of places where you know yourself, times and places where you know yourself, and try and be able to put yourself in there. So even if you can't go into church, you can walk around at the outside, go and touch it, find a sense of yourself in that. Finding normal. What are the normal things that you want to do before you've lost all this stuff? Is it just having your tea? Is it watching Coronation Street? Is it going for a walk? Find those normal things as much as is possible to help steady yourself, so you don't feel those shifting sands so strongly. We've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A lot of people think they're heading for becoming artists or musicians in a time of lockdown, especially if you're not at work, which would be the self-actualization phase of creativity, spontaneity, acceptance. And I don't think we're there. I think we're looking after our physiological needs. Are we breathing? Have we got food, water, shelter, clothing? Can we sleep? Maybe. Have we got health, employment, property, family, and social stability? That feels uncertain, doesn't it? It feels uncertain. In my household, where nobody knows what their employment is going to be by the end of the year, and therefore what the property is going to be. So we can see that is beginning to feel unsafe. We need to really concentrate on the physiological needs first, and then love and belonging, and then that self-esteem. That self-esteem is really important in order to cope with the losses. Although this looks like a pyramid, my suspicion is, as in many models, there's something of movement in it. Even within it, there's a sense of movement, isn't there? But we need to really be aware that to meet our physiological needs and to reassure people that it's taking quite a lot of energy, quite a lot of emotional energy, even just to live in lockdown, especially those people that have got children at home, so that also homeschooling. Emma Richardson came up with this stick person, which I think is really helpful to ask some questions. What are you standing on? What are the foundations? We've lost quite a lot of stuff that we think are our foundations. So what really are our foundations? Because they are still there. Connection. How do we stay connected with others, with God at this time? Sense of self. Where is it that you find your identity? What is it that you invest in? Really be honest about this. We have some idea that we need just to be spiritual beings, but the incarnation itself shows us God as material, God as human. It shows us that the material is also important. So where is it there that we find our identity? God, how do you connect with that which feeds you? How is it that you connect with God? And don't forget that. I think God might be in the foundations and in the connections and in the sense of self. So be really aware that we can be really explicit about how we connect with God, but we connect with God in all those areas. We've also got some blob trees. We've got the blob tree, which you might be familiar with. Who are you in this, and where would you like to be? The next one's more associated with Maslow. And the hierarchy of needs. What is it that you're doing? Where would you like to be? Why aren't you there? There are blob bereavement cards. These are much more associated with the death of somebody that we love. Still, I think they're useful in talking about loss. How is it that we experience loss? Do we experience loss as a sense that we're cracked, that half of us is missing, that there's somebody just not there, that we've got a hole in ourselves? We've got a few resources here. Mindsight, so drdansiegel.com does a Wheel of Awareness, which I think is a meditation tool more than anything else. Prayasugo.org has prayer tools, and it has a prayer meditation specifically for anxiety and loneliness and grief. There's ataloss.org, chewinitiatives.co.uk, understanding our past in our present is something to help young people. That's quite a useful tool. The Wild Edge of Sorrow is a book. Patrick Ness, it's a book. And there's a whole school approach to loss and bereavement, PDF here, which is really useful to use with children. But of course, next time we'll be recommending more tools for you. And of course, the blob, bereavement blob, as a set of cards, which can be used as a tool as well. Thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry we haven't got Cameron's marvellous spiritual observations at the end. He talked about this picture of Christ as the gardener wearing a hat. Mary weeping at the tomb as she thought she'd lost the Saviour. What happens in Holy Saturday in that period of loss? And how are we brought back into the experience of God as our Saviour?